And now I am very pleased to invite Dale Jarvis to deliver what I know and what you're going to experience is going to be just amazing, and an aspiring keynote address. Dale Jarvis, folklorist and Heritage NL Executive Director, holds a BSc in Anthropology, Archaeology from Trent University and MA in Folklore from Memorial University. For many years, he oversaw Heritage NL's Intangible Cultural Heritage Office, which helps communities to safeguard their traditional culture. Dale has contributed as a board member and volunteer to many local arts and heritage organizations. Former newspaper columnist and author of several books, he is a tireless promoter of local traditions. Dale will present on how community folklore is at the heart of regional identity, on identifying traditions and places at risk, sharing our stories, and planning our future. Please welcome Dale Jarvis.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a delight to be able to come and have a chat about something that I really love. So my name is Dale Jarvis. I'm Executive Director of the Heritage Foundation of Newfoundland and Labrador. Just a little bit of an introduction about who we are as an organization. Heritage NL is a provincial crown agency. We kind of operate as an arm's length agency under the Department of Tourism. And we've been around since 1984. Our primary kind of focus, the reason we were established, was to be the organization that designated heritage properties across the province and provided grants for the restoration of those properties. So many of the heritage buildings that you know in your communities across the province, we have about 340, I think, structures or so that we've designated and continue to designate and provide grants to. Our most recent designation was in Grand Falls, Windsor, with the Grand Falls House. And we have a board meeting coming up to look at new designations as well. We have a fairly small staff. I don't know if she's here right now. Is Andrea? Andrea, are you here? Oh, Andrea O'Brien, who is double duty counselor from the town of Cape Royal and our municipal outreach officer. We have a couple other staff people who are engaged in our office with accounting and with our Intangible Cultural Heritage program. And a large part of our work is to interact with communities and help communities kind of figure out ways to deal with their both their built heritage and their living heritage, which is what I'm going to be talking a little bit about today. And I know as a keynote speaker, you're supposed to, be inspiring and keep things light and positive. And so we're going to start with a murder. This is for you. Yeah. We're going to start with a murder. And our murder, well, the story starts around the 1840s. And it starts with a gentleman by the name of Cleaves. And there's some discrepancy in the historical record about where exactly he was born. Some people said that some records say that he came from Prince Edward Island. Some people believe, and I believe that it's probably more likely he came from Maine. But he entered into the lumbering business. And we know that by the 1870s, he was working on the Exploits River. He was here as a kind of a manager of logging teams in the Exploits River area, working under this gentleman, J.W. Phillips. J.W. Phillips, who had a large lumbering business here in Central. And we know that Mr. Cleaves and Mr. Phillips were kind of working originally in the Exploits River, and then at some point had kind of moved over into the Gander River area as well. Mr. Cleaves married apparently a very wealthy young lady from Enfield, Maine. Her family was also in the logging industry. And apparently she was quite wealthy and quite resourceful. She was actually the supervisor of schools in that part of Maine. By the 1890s, Phillips had moved his operation over towards the Gander the Gander River. And this is where things did not go well for Mr. Cleaves. He was working up around Gander Lake. He had a crew, and he got into some sort of labor disagreement with the bookkeeper. I don't know if any of this sounds familiar to anyone who's ever worked with bookkeepers, but there was some sort of disagreement over finances, shall we say. The bookkeeper's name was in different records, either Cater or Carter, probably Carter. And in the end of this argument, the bookkeeper picked up an auger, a wood auger like this, and gave our friend Mr. Cleaves 2 terrible blows to the head, rendered him most insensible, according to one newspaper record of the time. And he was put in his bed in the camp bunkhouse. And he kind of lingered around for 10 days, and then he died. And rumors started to spread about how the manager of this place, Mr. Cleaves, had been murdered. And word eventually got back to St. John's that this murder had taken place in the lumber woods in central Newfoundland. And so a crew was sent out to do an investigation into this murder. And they sent no one less than Judge Daniel Prouse, who is very well known to those of us who love Newfoundland history. Off he went with a doctor on the fairly new Newfoundland Railway at that point. Came here and then with a group of men hiked into the woods in search of this murder victim. And they reached the lumber camp near Gander Lake, and they packed the body into a coffin, and they had to walk out of the woods. And this was winter. It was winter time when all this was happening. And there's a fabulous little reference in the writings of Judge Prouse about how they had to walk out of the woods carrying this wooden coffin with this murder victim, supposed murder victim in the coffin. And he wrote in his journal about how one night they had to make camp on the way back, and they had laid the coffin out, and there was a snowfall that night. And there were a lot of snowshoe hair in the area, and they woke up in the morning to find snowshoe hair tracks all over the coffin of poor Mr. Cleaves. So they got to the railway, they loaded him up, and they took him back to Whitburn. At this point, this is what the Whitburn Station Hotel would have looked like, where they performed an autopsy on the body, and they determined that he actually hadn't died as a result of the blow of the head. He had died of complications from pneumonia. So it wasn't actually a murder after all. Sorry, Andy. And at that point, they turned his body over to a local minister, and the trail kind of goes cold there. I don't actually know exactly where Mr. Cleaves has where he is, where he rests in peace. That's work for a future day. And if any of you know the whereabouts of Mr. Cleaves, please tell me. So you're thinking, why is he going on and on about this ancient murder case? And the reason is that all of these things kind of flow out and impact history. You know, all of these little things that seem unconnected are still kind of where we are today. And these stories are part of who we are. Whether we know them or not, they have impacted the way that we interact. So Mr. Cleaves, though we largely forget his story, we keep his name around. His first name was Appleton, Mr. Appleton Cleaves. And the town of Appleton is where he built his first, one of his first sawmills, and loved the area so much that's where he settled. The other story about the other person who he had worked for, his boss, had a son whose name was George Leamington. So we have all these place names in Newfoundland that relate back. This is a very good example of how our history kind of informs where we are today. And certainly when we're thinking about heritage, you know, one of the things that I know we're talking about is sort of regional approaches. And certainly when we talk about things like Newfoundland culture or Labrador culture, I always say there is really no such thing as a Newfoundland culture. We are really a collection of different cultures that kind of share similarities, but then there are regional things that kind of bind us together. So for places like central Newfoundland, that history of lumbering and logging and working in the woods is very different from the story that you might hear in places like the Northern Peninsula or the South Coast or St. John's or other regions in the province. And we should be proud of those differences, and we should embrace what it is in our local regions that give flavor to our own local history. And certainly we have this very long history in the province of lumbering and woodworking and everything that revolves around kind of natural resources. Who remembers this building? The Deep Bite water wheel, a couple people. Kind of a fabulous example of a type of structure that was once very kind of common in parts of Newfoundland, and which we don't really see anymore. The number of sawmills that existed across the province was incredible. Now, when we look at historical records, this is one page of a list of sawmills in Atlantic Canada. It goes on for pages and pages and pages by province, just listing out the small sawmills. And I'm sure that these were really only a fraction of the number of sawmills that existed. So we think of these things as being sometimes things that happened in the past, but they're very much things that continue on. And this is one of the things that I like to stress about the difference between history and heritage. History is those things that happened in the past, where heritage is really those things that we take from the past and kind of continue to bring into the future as we move on. So, of course, sawmilling, lumbering is still an important part of our community life and community work, community employment. And again, sometimes we make a false disconnect between what's happening now and what happened in the past, where really it's all part of a spectrum. It's part of a continuum of our shared heritage. So we can talk about things like, Appleton Cleaves and other major entrepreneurs like Lewis Miller, who was so greedy, 3 towns named after him. So we can continue it, kind of move on. And when we think about, often I find at Heritage NL, when I start talking to people about traditional craft or traditional skills, people think of things like rug hooking and knitting, boat building, and yes, certainly those are traditional skills, but there's a whole other body of skills that have a traditionality to them. These are skills that people learn by doing, they learn from their families, they're passed down from generation to generation. And like every good folklorist now, when I go looking for things, I go directly to Facebook, because that's where everyone shares their stories and their skills. So when people post things about, offering business opportunities for things like sharpening sawmill blades, this is very much part of a living tradition, a living heritage that we can be proud of, I think, in the province. And this continues right up. So this is one, I just went into Facebook and looked for Newfoundland sawmills. This is one from Hiscock's sawmill in Winterton. That shows how one tradition is linked to other traditions. That's the other thing that I think is fascinating for people like me who study tradition and folklore and skills, is that one piece of our culture is intricately tied to another piece. So we talk about sawmilling or lumbering as if maybe it's a discrete piece, one piece of our history, but really it's a part of all these other things. So if you're raising animals and you need sawdust for bedding, where do you go? You go to your local sawmill and get that material. And things continue on. This was a fabulous post from just this year, the Firewood Factory in St. John's, excited to announce that we're venturing into the world of drone delivery for our campfire bundles. Perfect for evenings when you need just a bit more wood for the backyard fire, or those spontaneous moments when the kids want s'mores. Simply complete an order request online and Firewood Factory drone will deliver a campfire bundle to your yard, which they put out on the 1st of April earlier this year. So, there is ways in which culture interacts with each other in unpredictable ways sometimes. And it continues. We talk about how heritage being one of those things that links us to the past, but that brings us into the future. So yesterday, on the way here, Andrea and I had a meeting with the town of Glovertown to talk about this piece of history, the Sulfite Mill, the old Terra Nova Sulfite Mill in Glovertown. And one of the things that was said in our meeting was that up to a number of years ago, if you ask people in Glovertown what should happen with this rather incredible piece of architecture from the 1920s, half the town would have said, sure, blow it up, get rid of it, tear it down. It's an eyesore. And I think the town is recognizing now that they have something that's kind of a unique piece of Newfoundland history. This was a sulfite mill built by Norwegian companies in the 1920s. The Norwegian bank failed in 1921, 22. The kroner was devalued. The building never actually went into full production. And for the past 100 years, it's been the spot to, make out in Glovertown. And has like wonderful ghost stories associated with it and just an incredible piece of history. And so the town is actually now kind of looking at, okay, how do we take this thing that has been seen as a negative in our community, and how do we start to think about how do we turn this into a positive? What are the tourism potentials for things like this? We had a great conversation about, I think it would be an amazing space to have illuminated, to do kind of light shows, to have walking trails through it. They put up a fence recently, and I said, how's that working out for you? And of course, the moment they put up a fence, everyone was concerned that they no longer had access to this space. So for whatever nefarious purposes they want. I said, you need to find out everyone, you need to make a list of everyone who was conceived at the old mill. And that's your fundraising base right there. So we have in this province, this huge history of interacting with wood and wood products. This is a picture of the late Pian Panashwe, Innu canoe builder. And the detailed knowledge that these people had about living and working in nature, in the woods, the really incredible body of knowledge that these people have is almost impossible to put into a book or document in some way. This kind of lived experience is almost impossible to fully document it. It is a type of knowledge that needs to be lived and shared person to person, eye to eye, heart to heart, in order for it to be passed along. This is one of Jerome Canning's Rodneys here. Jerome Canning, a master boat builder with the Wooden Boat Museum. The Wooden Boat Museum in Winterton was built on the work in some ways of American folklorist Dr. David Taylor, who came up to MUN, did to his master's and PhD thesis in the Department of Folklore, and his dissertation kind of became the basis of the plan and the exhibits around the Winterton Boat Museum. And he has this great quote about going out into the woods with some of these older boat builders. He did a lot of his work in the 1980s. All of the men that he interviewed are no longer with us. But he talked about how he could go out with one particular man who could see the boats in the trees. He could look at a tree and know which part of the tree he could use for which part of a boat. And that kind of knowledge, that kind of incredibly detailed knowledge, is something that, frankly, we're worried about at Heritage NL, because we are not maybe passing along some of those skills in quite the same way. And like I said, one piece of culture is linked to another piece of culture. So our woods traditions are linked to our boat building traditions. We have this amazing early industrial history in Newfoundland and Labrador that, quite frankly, as a province, we're not really great at celebrating. Often when we think of Newfoundland history, we think of the fishery, but there are all sorts of other ways that Newfoundlanders made work. Another Grand Falls photo for you here. You know, the Grand Falls mill basket, these mill baskets that the workers took to the mills everywhere where there was a mill town in Newfoundland. And these are things that let us start thinking about things like labor history and who did the work where, who packed the lunches, who took the lunches to their fathers who were working in the mill. All these other kinds of related industries and related traditions. And when one piece starts to fall apart, all the other pieces start to fall apart as well. So when we look at a photo like this of the Tetfords slide hauling in Harbor Grace in 1930, you know, they're out collecting probably firewood here, but there's all these other traditions, just, you know, things like knot tying, catamaran making, harness making, animal husbandry, the whole business around Newfoundland ponies, the clothing that the men are wearing and how that was made and who made it. All of these traditions, when one piece starts to go, everything kind of starts to unravel a little bit. And when we lose one tradition, chances are we're going to lose another tradition alongside it. And this is a good example of one of these little tiny traditions that is regionally sort of important. This is a type of weaving that was done by men working in lumber camps. Here it's called Pillowtop Weaving. There's a couple other names for this. This is a piece that was made by Raymond Pop Russell when he worked in the Lumberwoods. He was from Lethbridge. He's no longer with us. But he had made that particular piece of Pillowtop Weaving in the 1950s. Working in the Lumberwoods on you got one day off a week. You couldn't go home. You got Sunday off. And the men had to find something to do with their time. Some men would spend that time maybe playing cards, but if you were a religious man, you wouldn't be playing cards on Sunday, or else bad things might happen, which we can talk about later, when you're trying to go to sleep. So what the men in some of the Lumberwoods would do, they would have, you know, their Newfoundland knit wool socks, and they would unravel their socks, and then they would set up these little weaving frames, and they would weave these what they called pillow tops that you would use as cushions or covers for chairs or whatnot, as gifts for their wives and their sweethearts when they went back home. And when we went looking, the Pop Russell's granddaughter, Nicole Penny, who's an archivist at the Mun Folklore and Language Archive, when she showed me this, I had never seen it before. I had never heard of it. I didn't know anything about it. And we went looking for people who actually knew how to do this craft in the province. We could find two people who were alive who knew how to do this. There might have been more. We couldn't find them. They might have been out there. And so we started a project. This was now a 10-year-old project, teaching people how to weave this type of very, very particular type of craft. And since then, ourselves and the rooms have taught hundreds of people how to weave this particular type of what was a male craft. This was a man's type of textile craft. And often when we think about textile work in Newfoundland, we think of it as being women's work. But in reality, men, especially men who were out working in the Lumberwoods, they were doing work. We've had lots of women tell us the best person for darning socks was my father or grandfather, that it was the men that the women knew how to knit, but it was the men that knew how to darn because they were the ones out making holes in the socks and having to fix them when there were no women around. All of this stuff is what UNESCO, the United Nations Scientific and Educational Cultural Foundation, call intangible cultural heritage. And in 2003, there was a UNESCO convention that came about around safeguarding intangible cultural heritage. I'm sure you're all familiar with World Heritage Sites. We have a number of World Heritage Sites here in the province. Most recently, Mistaken Point. We have Red Bay, a number of other World Heritage Sites. Heart's Content is up currently as a potential World Heritage Site because of its connection to the transatlantic telegraph line. There is now, since 2003, kind of a sister convention to the World Heritage Sites around intangible things, and member states can nominate things like Chinese shadow puppetry or the abacus. Tango dancing has been listed as part of our World Heritage. And in Newfoundland, one of our own, Dr. Jerry Pocius at the folklore department, was involved in the early drafting of this. And it's written in very kind of legalistic UN type language, but what intangible cultural heritage is. But really, it's about all those knowledge and skills that communities recognize as part of their living heritage. And that is transmitted from generation to generation. ICH, living heritage, these are the things that we're really concerned about. So way back in 2006, we started doing work on this. And in 2008, the province developed a strategy for how we start to deal with intangible cultural heritage. It's easy with things like an object or an artifact or a photograph or a document. You put those in a museum, you put those in an archive, and they're preserved. What do you do with living traditions? How do you keep something like pillowtop making or sawmill blade sharpening? How do you keep those skills alive? So the provincial strategy, which Heritage NL is responsible for enacting, kind of has these four key pieces. We document what we can, we celebrate things. The most common question I get when I'm out chatting with people is, why do you care about that old foolishness? That's probably the question I get most often. And I think people quite often devalue the knowledge they have. They think the knowledge they have isn't special. And so part of our work is just showing people that, yes, absolutely, the work that you do on a day-to-day basis has incredible value for you and your community and your generations to come. We're really concerned about transmission, this idea that we have to find ways of sharing skills. And cultural industry. People need to eat. People need to put bread on the table. And in many ways, some of these things have a very definite way of generating local income. And so since 2008, we've been doing all kinds of stuff. We've been encouraging foolishness. We've been kicking at things to move them along. And whenever I can, I have tea with hookers. And I tell you, if you put out a press release that says you're having tea with hookers, CBC calls you back. They want to know all the dirt about having tea with hookers. And so over the past few years, one of the things that kept coming up and keeps coming up when we talk to communities is there's always people who are worried about the risk of losing things. That there are certain things that we're just maybe not protecting in the same way, or there are things that our grandparents did that we're worried don't continue on. This is a very good example around, well, I won't say what you would call this if you were out in the woods, this dirty old thing that you would put on the fire. But tin kettle making is one of the things that kind of came up. And there are certainly people who know how to make tin kettles. And that doesn't necessarily indicate when something is at risk. There are people out there who can make tin kettles. What we found and still haven't found is someone who makes tin kettles who is willing to teach that process to other people. And that is kind of a measure of how things are at risk. It's not just that there are few people doing it, it's that there are fewer opportunities to learn how to do those things. So we started to compile a list, and this was based on a project in the UK. There's a Heritage Craft Association in the UK who were very, very generous and gave us all their kind of behind the scenes work and how they compiled all their lists, and they let us kind of take and adapt and steal anything they had, which was very appreciated. And we put out the first craft at risk list in 2021, and there were 55 crafts that were listed as as being at risk, with one craft listed as having become extinct within the last generation, and that is rope making. We used to have a big rope making industry in Newfoundland, and because of changes in technology and the fisheries, we don't make rope anymore. We used a similar system to what an environmental kind of extinctions list might. So listing things by critically endangered, and then ones that are currently viable rather. And so this is some of the ones that we listed as being critically endangered. We mentioned making kettle and tent stove making, kind of an endangered craft. Bark tanning. Lots of people will have memories of fishermen barking nets or barking canvas. Again, because the industry has changed, not as many reasons to do that as there might have been. It's like wheel writing. We found that we couldn't find anyone actually who still makes wheels, wooden wheels in the province. Since then, someone has moved back to the province who is a wheelwright, moved back from Alberta. Spruce root basket making, which I'll come back to, and things like hat making. As fashions change, our need for some of these things evolve as well. The list came up with a number of recommendations that came from crafters, that came from people who were making things. They said, these are the things that we need in order to continue these traditions forward. And one of them was a mentor apprentice program. And we were able to secure some funding through the provincial government. We had a project over 2 years, and this was an employment program, about $400,000 project over 2 years to develop mentor apprentice programs for people in communities to teach these skills. So these were grants that paired up people who had skills with people who wanted to learn those skills and carry those skills forward. And we had a whole range of different things that people trained under. So things like, including things like foraging and preserving food. This is a photo of one of our mentors from Fairyland, making wriggle fences there. Because we have an interest in heritage buildings and the preservation of heritage buildings. Things like historic window repair. We had a mentorship program developed around that. And these were one-year programs that let people over a period of time work together, get together and share those skills and knowledge. We had 45 people for projects all across the province, everyone from teenagers to seniors. A great kind of breakdown of participants by gender. We had great input from our Indigenous partners, people with disabilities. A great kind of, this is the kind of numbers that grant agencies love to see when we do this sort of thing. And we kind of addressed, the question that we get asked all the time is, why does any of this matter? Why does heritage matter? You're talking a lot about all these things that might be at risk, and maybe things die for a reason. Why does any of this stuff matter? I think, for one, our skills and traditions and knowledge are a really important part of who we are as a people. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is about building community. We want healthy communities in some way. And so just giving people a chance to come together and talk and share skills and share knowledge to make our history come alive. This is one of our great mentorship pairs, Danny White, Mi'kmaq spruce root basket maker, teaching Arlene White here the craft, the art of spruce root basket making. And this is kind of an interesting thing that happens in Newfoundland that doesn't quite happen in other parts of North America in quite the same way. The basket making tradition that we have here in Newfoundland, the Mi'kmaq basket making tradition, is a little bit different from the Mi'kmaq basket making traditions on the mainland. A lot of the Mi'kmaq basket making traditions on the mainland use ash. And ash as ash trees, which really don't grow in Newfoundland. But what do we got? We got a lot of spruce roots. And so tradition has kind of evolved, again, thinking regionally, thinking about what we do that is specific or unique in our region. We have this craft tradition here that we can be proud of that's a little bit different from craft traditions elsewhere. So first reason is just, it's part of who we are. It links us to our past, it builds community. The second thing is that a lot of these skills that people have potential to be utilized in some sort of business fashion. So a lot of the crafts that we're doing, there is an economic reason why people should be investing in these crafts. You know, one of the mentorships we had was around foraging and food production. Anyone who has dined out in Newfoundland in the last 10 years knows how important now local ingredients are within the food industry. And that idea of traditional recipes, local foods, all of that is saleable. The biggest, most famous restaurateurs in the province are doing work around local food, local ingredients. That's what tourists want when they come. They want to experience traditional Newfoundland food. They want to experience food that is made with ingredients that are as local as possible. The other one there is one of our mentor-apprentice pairs. We're working on bodhrán making, drum making. This is a picture from Brian's website here of one of the drums he has under construction that he was sending off to the States. And these days, with the internet and social media, we're able to market these local skills and export them and build business locally. This was one of our mentor teams up in Labrador who were making cometics, making skidoo boxes. So again, using traditional skills to build things that there is a market for. And currently, you know, there is a huge market around snowmobiling and winter tourism, lots of opportunities for the passing on of these skills in an entrepreneurial kind of fashion. So from our small mentorship program that we started, already we're seeing these kinds of small local businesses evolve. So we had one of our mentors, Megan Sams, Mi'kmaq from Codroy Valley, Jane Walker. They came back, they were in Iceland for an entire month, showcasing their work earlier this year. They're writing a book. Kevin Drew, who is one of our apprentices, is now making moccasins to sell at Mi'kmaq. Brian Poirier, who I mentioned here, has started Poirier Drums, and Neil Hammond has started Hammond Woodwork. Has started his own woodworking building, making and restoring wooden doors and windows. He just got the contract to repair the windows for the John Howard Society in St. John's. So he already has, the last time I was talking to his mentor, he already had since January $50,000 worth of orders for work. So entrepreneurialism is one thing. And the reason is that sometimes older technologies are important ways, they provide important tools or clues for us when we think about how we start to deal with things like climate change and food security and those kinds of things. This is a project we did with one of our instructors, Ken Tuak from Pinns Brook, who is a 4th or 5th generation stonemason. We had him on the east coast of the island doing dry stone walling instruction. We had 2 workshops in Brigus, and we had a week in the middle. So we went to Carbonear and worked with the municipal council workers and teaching them how to do dry stone walling, and rebuilt a wall that had been taken down. I had a chat last year or the year before with one of my colleagues who works for the Devon Rural Skills Trust in the UK. So it's a group of people who are interested in traditional skills like dry stone walling and fence making, all those kind of traditional skills. They often run dry stone walling workshops. They said, when they run a certification course, so you can actually become certified as a dry stone waller, the employment rate for those programs is 100%. Everyone they graduate with a certificate in dry stone walling gets work. We have, I think, maybe 2 certified dry stone wallers in the province. So one of the things we're thinking about is going, how do we build those skills level? You know, there is clearly a market in the landscaping industry for people who are skilled and knowledgeable around some of these practices. I have seen in St. John's a lot of really badly made stone walls made by landscape companies who stacking rocks, not necessarily building something that will last for 100, 200 years. Those skills exist. We just aren't utilizing them to the best of our ability. And if you've been following the news this week in Carbonear, you know, this is part, again, of a living heritage. This is part of a tradition that has been based in the past, that has continued on. And so when we look at these things that have existed and continue to exist, there are other reasons why we can take these forward. One of the things that we love at Heritage NL is root cellars, because we think it's a really interesting kind of example of how our past has really some strong implications for how we might do things in the future. And as we become more and more interested in things like food security and sustainability, home gardening, backyard homesteading, food preservation. You know, our grandparents knew how to do all of these things. And in the 1950s, 1980s, we abandoned all of that in favor of technologies and techniques that are now proving to be detrimental to our health and to the environment. The old ways of doing things are sometimes, with modern applications and modern knowledge, better ways of doing things. So there are very real practical benefits for understanding some of this traditional knowledge that comes from the past and will carry us forward into the future. So where do we start? You know, I know you're going to have a lot of discussions about things like climate change and healthcare and regionalization and really important things. And sometimes people think, oh my God, like heritage is the last thing that we got to worry about garbage collection. Like we don't have time to think about heritage. And what I think we are trying to encourage people to think about is to think about less as heritage as a thing that needs to be preserved, and more about heritage as a tool that lets us do other things. So if we're thinking about food security, or we're thinking about business development, we're thinking about tourism strategies, we're thinking about community engagement, heritage is one tool, and sometimes a kind of inexpensive tool that you have in your municipal toolkit that lets you do some of these other things. And where we start, really, and this kind of comes out of my background as a folklorist, is that we start just with research. We start making lists of what we actually have in our community. And one of the things that we've been doing are these traditional skills inventories in regions, just sort of identifying who exists in that region that has a skill and who is willing to teach that skill to someone else. This was a project that we did with support from the Harris Center as part of their Thriving Regions program. We started this right at the start of the pandemic, which was a really interesting time to try and go out and meet with people and talk to people. But we pulled together this list for the Baccalieu Coastal Drive of people who had traditional skills. So if you are, you know, on the Baccalieu Trail and you want to, and if you, let's say you're a bed and breakfast owner, you have people coming from away, they want to have an experience where they learn how to play 120s. Well, we have this inventory now. You can call Ed Spurl. There's his number. He can come to your guests and teach them how to play 120s. Maybe he'll bring some dried capelin along with him. Who knows? And into this, we built in a little piece into this as sort of a guide for tourism operators. Okay, how do we then pay these people for their time? Because we can certainly charge a tourist for the experience of learning to play 120s. Quite often within the heritage community, we tend to do this work for free. Like, why would someone pay us to learn 120s? Well, there's business opportunities there. And so if a business operator, someone who's already in the industry, is looking to partner with tradition bearers to provide services for guests, we made some recommendations around what is an appropriate honorarium for those people. How do you give people money? Because again, one of our goals is a cultural industry. How do people get paid for the work and the knowledge that they have? But making the list is a really kind of important first step. We need to know who is out there and who is willing to share these. I was talking with John Gowdy on Labrador Morning this morning about today's conference and what I was going to be talking about. And he said, how do we do this? Like, how do municipalities kind of start? And I think one of the very first things that we can do that is very straightforward is just creating opportunities. Once we've identified who those people are, creating opportunities for people to come together and share those skills. We have facilities in our communities where we can do this. Every community has a town hall, a community hall, a parish hall with a kitchen. The Pasadena Heritage Society has been doing great stuff over the last 4 or 5 years, leading intergenerational workshops around bread making, jam making. They did a moose bottling workshop where you could come and learn how to bottle moose in Pasadena. They're doing 2 workshops coming up this spring around dandelion jam, dandelion jelly making. They've already completely sold out their 2 workshops that they had planned. There's a really huge demand and a thirst for this kind of interactive intergenerational learning in our communities. Quite often, people will say to us, where do we get funding for kind of heritage projects? And I always say, if you find out, let me know, because I would love there to be more funding for heritage projects. When we do work like this, other sorts of funding, there's lots of funding opportunities out there. We've done a number of these kind of skills sharing programs with funding programs that I'm sure you're already using in your communities. Things like New Horizons for Seniors. Who has ever gotten a New Horizons for Seniors grant in your community? Often those things are used for kind of infrastructure, like for putting in wheelchair ramps or making buildings accessible. They also let you do kind of cultural programs for seniors. We've accessed mental health funding to allow us to build kind of storytelling. We do a mug up session with seniors in communities, getting them to share their stories. We've used mental health funding for that. There was a really great project a number of years ago in Branch on the Cape Shore, where they accessed some money for healthy aging, like keeping seniors fit, and did a project around traditional square set dancing in the community. Again, these funding partners, the funding agencies, they're not listing heritage as their primary goal. They're looking at all these other things that you as municipalities have to think about aging populations and the reduction of isolation among seniors and mental health and physical activity. And again, heritage is one of your little tools that you have to make these things kind of happen and engage your community. So I hope that kind of gives you some ideas about thinking about history and thinking about heritage as part of a living tradition. Part of our role is to work with you. We had meetings yesterday with the town of Glovertown. We had a meeting with the Beaches Heritage Center out of Eastport. We're leaving tomorrow off to Pasadena. We're having meetings in Deer Lake and Cormac. One of our workers is off in Port-au-Port right now. And we are often on the road. We're going to go down to the Codroy Valley next week and look at what may be, I'm very excited about this project, what may be the very last potentially operational carding mill in Newfoundland. There's a huge interest right now in things like sheep production on one side and knitting on the other side. And the missing piece that we have in the province is that how do you get the wool into something that knitters can use? Again, we have had that technology here in the province. How do we kickstart that and get those things up and running again? Because there is then a benefit to the agricultural, the farming industry, and a benefit to the craft industry. And think about how we make heritage come alive, working for our communities. So if you have any questions, we are easy to find. We are on every social media you can think of. If you look, our website, heritagenl.ca, is probably the easiest way to get in touch with us. If you have any questions about it's kind of the more kind of legislative aspects of the Municipalities Act and designating heritage buildings, Andrea is the expert on that. Also a great expert on cemetery kind of conservation. If you have any questions about local cemeteries and what you need to do or shouldn't do, we have a whole presentation that we call Don't Be At It for people who want to start doing work in historic cemeteries. Our role is to help and to work with you. We always want an excuse to get out of St. John's. No offense, Mayor Breen, wherever you are. We love getting out of St. John's and doing work with communities because we really do feel that you know, going back to the kind of the reason for this, the heart of our communities, I really think is our heritage, our local culture, and our local folklore. And whatever we can do as an organization to help you build programs to celebrate that and transmit that information onto the next generation, we are here to help you do those things. So that's it for me. I'll save you the murder stories for later tonight. But we have some time. So we have some time for questions. If you have questions about any kind of heritage opportunities that you have in your communities, or if you have questions about where to start, that's often where we start our conversation with communities about what they need to do first. Yes. So, yes, we often get asked this question, and we are the provincial agency that is tasked with providing grants to heritage buildings. The grand total of funding that we get from the province for every heritage building in the province is $150,000 a year. Yeah, write a letter to your MHA. So we do have grants, and quite often though, what happens with our grants is that there are other funding agencies out there, you know, the ACOAs and the provincial government who require communities to have a certain percentage of funding to run those projects. And so quite often what we are able to do is kind of provide that like 10% funding that you can lever some money out of other places. And even if we don't have funding specifically for your property or the project that you're working on, we're pretty good at helping you try and figure out where those other funding pots are. So if you have a project that you are looking for funding for a building or other kind of museum project or whatnot, give us a call. And even if we don't have the specific funding, we can help you try and figure out the best route to go for to get that funding. There are a few people who are doing soap making, you know, for commercial, like small businesses. Yeah, there are a few people who are doing that kind of work. To teach it, that's a good question. I don't know. I'll add it to our list. One of the things that we're looking at, I mentioned how we did that craft at risk list in 2021. We are looking at doing that. The idea is that we'll do it every 2 years. That will kind of revamp it and get feedback from the community about what skills are wanted and what skills are needed. So soap making isn't one that someone has mentioned before. So I'll mentally add it to the list. Yeah. Great. Well, then we'll chat. I saw another hand somewhere. Yeah. Oh, you have a, okay. Excellent. Good. Yes.
But I also know a guy in critical coals that makes soap as well.
Yeah. What we find quite often, and this is a really good example, is that often there are people who are doing these kinds of things. So if you are a soap maker, quite often you might be very good at what you do. You might have a lot of knowledge, but you might kind of be working in isolation. We did a project a number of years ago around make and break engines. Make and break engines were something that, again, communities kept saying, you know, we're concerned about this. We do work with the boat museum. They're interested in make and break engines. And we found that there were people, mostly men, fiddling around in their sheds, repairing make and break engines. But there was no way for them to identify each other or to communicate with each other around kind of the business of make and break engines. So that's where we come in as an agency, as an organization, because we have the resources to kind of figure out who all these people are. So we hired a student from Memorial to kind of track down who all these people were who were making and working on make and break engines. The Wooden Boat Museum had done a tremendous amount of research collecting information on boat builders in the province. So we were able to work with them to kind of access their list of people, and then phoning town offices and saying, anyone in your town make and break engines? And we compiled a list of people. Then we had an event. We partnered with Parks Canada at the Ryan premises in Bonavista, and we had a day dedicated to make and break engines. Anyone who could bring their boat with their make and break. We had a flotilla around the harbor, and the make and breaks all puttered around. So there was a public kind of community building aspect to it. But then what we did afterwards was we just had an empty parking lot in Bonavista, and we had a parts swap. So all these old fellows came with their pickup trucks and their rusty bits of whatever in the trunk, and just had an opportunity to meet each other and sell their pieces or trade their pieces. I am not a mechanic. I don't know a lot about make and break engines personally, but I guess one of the things that wears out, there's a little spring that wears out quite often. Apparently they're hard to find. One of the fellas that came had found a company in Ontario that could fabricate these springs. He came with a great big bag of springs, and he was handing them out like Santa Claus to all the fellas with their make and break engines. We built a Facebook group where people who were on Facebook could join the make and break engine group. That still exists. I poke my head into the Facebook group every so often, and someone's looking for such and such a part for Acadia, whatever. I have no idea what's going on. I take my head back out of the group, but the group kind of runs itself now. And the Wooden Boat Museum has been interested. They've run workshops with some of those people, getting those people to run instructive workshops on how to build or how to repair make and break engines. We did interviews with boat builders and make and break engine repair people, digitized all those interviews, put those information online. We found old repair manuals, did the same thing, digitized them, put them online. So whatever the identified need is, we can help kind of build that community of people to do the work. So if it's soap making, maybe we can find a way to kind of create a little side group that deals with soap. We did that for weavers and spinners. We started a group again on Facebook for weavers and spinners all across the province who are interested in building looms. We actually just funded a little tiny project on the Labrador Straits, where they had a number of old looms that had belonged to the Women's Institute. They had 5 or 6 looms that were in pieces, and they didn't know what to do. We partnered with the Labrador Artist Co-op on the Straits. We sent up a folklorist from our office, and we sent up a young weaver, Jessica McDonald from St. John's. They went up to the Straits, they put the looms back together, and then taught the women locally how to thread the looms and how to start weaving. So often, and now there is part of that artist co-op, there will be people who are going to weave scarves or whatnot and then generate local income. So there are always ways, if we can identify a group of people that share a common interest. Part of what my role is to act as a facilitator and to help bring those people together and connect them, and maybe give them some access to things like entrepreneurial training, or talk to them about how to do oral history work so they can better collect the information that they want to work on. It's a very long-winded answer about soap. There you go. Yeah.
You were talking about carding. In Cowhead, there's a wool studio, Skivers. So she kind of walked you through the process of dyeing the wool. She uses all natural products and the carding process, and then she creates her own wool.
Yeah.
That she then sells. But I just thought I'd let you know that if you ever want to check it out, it's pretty
Yeah.
cool.
And I think what we have, like, I know there are lots of people out there who are kind of doing that whole from sheep to sock sort of process. And the carding they're doing, they're using the carding paddles and they're doing it by hand. What they have in Millville, again, talking about place names, Millville, where all the carding mills were, they have the industrial carding machines. And I think that is kind of a piece that we're looking at and saying, okay, if we want to really kind of build these industries, if we want to kind of enhance, right now, the majority of sheep that we raise in the province is for meat. And the sheep producers are shearing their sheep and throwing away the wool because it doesn't make economic sense for them to do anything with that wool. We have to send that wool away to be professionally carded, to be produced in any kind of mass quantities. The weavers and spinners are bringing in all the materials from Briggs and Little and wherever else. So we're not exporting the wool that we have, and then we're importing a final product when we have the material here in the province. Again, what we need is just kind of better communication along two industries that know they're kind of related but don't really talk to each other. So maybe that's our role as a heritage organization, is to provide that kind of bridge between manufacturers and producers at different levels and get them thinking about, okay, how do we turn this into an opportunity that's profitable for everyone? Part of that might be I'm missing, while I'm on the road, there is a sheep shearing course happening in St. John's, and I'm here talking to you because you're so lucky. But I mean, there are opportunities for us to kind of start thinking, I guess, creatively and critically about the industries and traditions that we have and how we take steps to kind of move those things forward in a way that is beneficial for communities. I will be around, happy to answer any questions, and I'm sure Andrea will be happy to answer any of your municipalities. Thank you very much.